Here we go. So thanks again. I appreciate it. I'm going to talk today a little bit about what a topic that is of great interest to me. Well, two topics really. One is what can we do in spatial temporal statistics at the interface of AI and statistical modeling and statistical inference. But also, I have a great interest in wildfire modeling, and that's one of the things I want to focus on here. And so, without further ado, let me just. I should mention my collaborators. LeCun Zhang is an assistant professor here at Mizzou. Young-Soo Yu was a PhD student of mine. Now he's a postdoc at UT Austin. Kiran Bhagnagar is a turbulence modeler that we collaborate with. Xiaoyu Ma is a PhD student of mine, and LeCun's, and then Raphael Huser is at Kaust and has also contributed to this work. So, that being said, the thing about wildfire is just take a look at that video on the right. It's really kind of cool because this is in the desert southwest of the U.S. and you see these plumes from three fires, and you see this dust storm from a front that's moving down from the north. And I think that's kind of illustrative of why I like this topic, because there's so many things that interact in this process. But why it's important is because, of course, tremendous potential for loss of human life in wildfires, property destruction, ecological devastation, and many health impacts from smoke in particular, in terms of lung damage, heart damage, and even some evidence that perhaps dementia might be related to fine particulate from wildfires. Um, and of course, one of the reasons why we hear so much more about it now is because of the wildland urban interface and the fact that we keep building closer and closer to where fire potential is greater. And this was came to light very starkly in January of this year on the Southern California fires and Palisades and et cetera. And 30 deaths and approximately $50 billion worth of damage from those fires. And we all saw those images. It's terrible. And just a couple years before that, another similar event happened in Maui, in Lahaina. And again, in this case, 102 deaths, very fast-moving fire, $5.5 billion worth of damage. So this stuff keeps happening, but what I want you to be aware of is that it's not just those big events. There's fires that are happening all the time. You might have seen the news this morning about a big wildfire in New Jersey. Turned out that was caused by a bonfire. And even if you look in the lower right, you see even today, this was from this morning, there's all sorts of wildfires going on in the U.S. right now. Um, and why does that matter? Well, it's kind of interesting because I live in Missouri, which is here where my cursor is, and next door in Kansas, in the fall and in the spring, this is a pretty typical event, combination of wildfires and controlled burns. And why that matters to me, well, matters for all sorts of reasons. One, that's partly due to agricultural management, but it's also due to ecological management. And sometimes it just gets out of control. And we get the smoke effect from that. And anymore, no matter where you live in the US, you're probably in the summer going to be exposed to wildfire smoke. And this was just one day last summer. And it was a bad day for us here in Missouri, and that's kind of unusual. So I guess the point is that this stuff is happening all the time, and they're increasing because of climate change, because the fuel load increases, land management practices are changing, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. Um, and I feel like this is one of the big problems that we have here, in terms of trying to mitigate the effects of increasing wildfires. And as I mentioned before, the interface between urban areas where people live and potential fire-prone um, wildlands are increasing as well. And so, why does or how does statistics play a role? Well, there's been quite a bit of work that's done on modeling the health impacts of fine particulate, and by some of the people that I saw in the room here. And I'm not going to talk about that, not because I don't think it's interesting, just because I haven't really worked in that space yet. But it's super important. Also, there's plenty of statisticians and some again in this room who have worked on modeling the risk of wildfire. And I think that's important and will continue to be so. And then less so have statisticians been involved in modeling the dynamics of fire plumes and how they might spread after they're ignited. Those are probably my two biggest interests, but I'm going to talk about all three of these red highlighted things in this talk. All of these things relate to complex spatial temporal processes, and that's what I'm going to focus on. So I'll give you a little bit of an overview of that, not much, a few slides from a short course that Andrew Zemet, Manjon, and Noel Cressy and I did. We'll talk about some hybrid statistical AI models, just generally, and then I'll focus in on what I really want to talk about here, which is a couple of examples, one in modeling fire extremes and for a couple of different purposes, and then modeling fire front dynamics. So it's not a technical talk. I'll show you a few things here and there that have some equations in them, but that really isn't the point of this talk, but those details are available in the papers that I cite. So let's talk about modeling spatial temporal processes. And um, you know, what's interesting to me is that no matter what scale you look at in time or in space, um, something interesting is going on. And when those things are combined, which most often they are, um, you get even more interesting structures and you get interactions across these scales. And I just think it's really quite interesting to look in these plots. If you look at the picture, the Hubble telescope image, and you just pick some region in that space, and then you take the brain cell neural activity image in the lower right, they look sort of similar, right? I mean, and that's just the nature of different kind of spatial point processes over um, how their dynamics evolved. But it's kind of cool that it's happening at different scales. So I just want to make a point that it's not sufficient just to consider spatial fields by themselves or time series because there's the interaction that's important. And I want to illustrate this with one of the most destructive fires in California history and in U.S. history, which was the Camp Fire in 2018. And if you look at the lower left, you see air quality in San Francisco, and the air quality got quite poor as that fire started developing, and got even very unhealthy, as you can see. That unfortunately doesn't tell us much about what was happening, right? We know that there was a fire that caused that, but we don't know much about the fire that caused it. We have no information about how much damage it did or how many lives it took. And similarly, if you look at a burn scar from a particular time point, which is just showing you where the fire boundaries are, that doesn't tell you much either. I mean, it tells you kind of where the damage was, but it doesn't tell you how it got there. And even in the lower right, where this is satellite imagery, which shows a few different time steps, shows the plume, that doesn't really tell us a whole lot either. So what I'm interested in is thinking about modeling these kinds of processes where space and time are included at the same time. And when you do that, you have to start thinking whether you actually include it in your model or you use proxies for it. You have to start thinking about interactions across these large scales. There's natural linkages, for example, between, say, an El Nino event and how it might change the atmospheric circulation, which then affects how much precipitation falls and where it falls, which then affects soil moisture, which then affects whether or not you're in a drought, which affects the green vegetation, which then provides fuels for fire. So all these things are interconnected. And if you're thinking about mitigating the effects of fire, for example, then one has to think about, well, how much is this a drought area, or is this what's the fuel load in this particular area, et cetera. So this is all important. And the way that we traditionally model spatial temporal processes, not everyone subscribes to this, but I kind of think that it's a general kind of state space approach where you think about your observations conditioned on some true process. So you can kind of get the sampling and measurement error part of this out of the way in the first level, and then you focus on this really important process that you care about, spatial temporal process, for example. And that might have a trend or some covariate effects, but then it almost always in the kinds of work that I do at least has some dependent random process. And that ends up being where a lot of the focus is. And I believe that there's really two main approaches to that. One is a descriptive approach and one is a dynamic approach to handling that term. And the descriptive approach is nice because it's sort of we think about this marginally, and there's always a bit of a tension in statistics between in like mixed modeling between a marginal perspective and a conditional perspective, and that's true here as well because in essence these are just mixed models over time and space. But it's nice because, in other words, we're going to characterize this dependent random process in terms of its moments, its means, its covariances, perhaps its skewness, et cetera. And a perfect example of this, and the one that is used the most and has been for many, many years because it's so effective, is a Gaussian process, which is a process that describes how space and time are dependent everywhere and is usually covariance based with a covariance and mean functions. And so that covariance is usually specified in some distance-based manner, like nearby locations in time and space are more related. That's the first law of geography. And these are really super useful for prediction, which is where this stuff started. I mean, filling in gaps. It's sometimes called kriging. But it's also used for parameter estimation. If I have some fixed effects and I want to account for the dependent structure, this is the framework that you might do that. But it can be challenging to represent realistic dependence and interaction of complex processes. As I mentioned, there's a lot of stuff going on in the background here. And can we really specify that well? And sometimes we can, and sometimes it doesn't matter, and sometimes we can't. This is also, I would argue, the way that we had traditionally modeled spatial extremes or dependent spatial extremes, which are super important due to climate change and all sorts of other environmental drivers. And so this is still a very useful paradigm. The alternative is a conditional approach or a dynamic approach that says, well, I'm just going to think about more, I guess, a mechanistic way of looking at things, how a spatial process might evolve through time from past values. Maybe other things influence that evolution. And so, for example, if I've got this spatial field, I want to see how it evolves into the next time. I have this evolution function f. It depends on some parameters. I have some innovation noise process involved with that. And this is also quite challenging. I mean, you can have quite simple models here or very complex models, but the idea is, can we specify a realistic transition function that's also kind of parsimonious in terms of its parameter structure? And also, what do we do about the innovation distribution? Is it sufficient to assume it's Gaussian? Do we need heavy tails? Do we need some sort of mixture? And then how do we go about estimation in these settings? And so there's been all sorts of development over the last 10 or 20 years in these solving these problems from both the descriptive and the dynamic sense. So we've gotten really good at efficient estimation of Gaussian processes with all sorts of different methods. We're getting a lot better. It's still a developing area. We're getting a lot better at dealing with multivariate processes. Maybe not in super high dimensions yet, but it's getting better all the time. The dependent extreme literature has really taken off. I'll mention some more of that later. In the dynamic context, using kind of physics-informed models or mechanistic science-informed models has really helped. Having kind of deep hierarchical structures help because we can condition dependent structures down the hierarchy, and in increasingly more nonlinear models to represent more realistic topics. But these are still quite limited for complex processes. I mean, I say that, and I use them all the time, and I don't mean to diminish the great work that's been done. I'm just saying that for some processes, it's not quite efficient, or the complexity can't quite be handled yet. But this is exactly what deep neural models are good at. They're good at modeling complex dependent structures, and they're good at doing it efficiently, relatively efficiently computationally. So it's natural that we start thinking about hybrid approaches here. And not everyone will agree with this sort of Venn diagram of relationship between deep learning, statistics, artificial intelligence, et cetera. But I kind of like it because I feel like statistics encompasses all of these things for sure. But the thing that deep learning is good at is things like CNN, RNNs, and graph neural nets, and things like that to deal with complex space-time dependence. Um, but less so about dealing with uncertainty quantification and less so about interpretability, as we all know. Whereas the stat models, not 100% true, but typically are good in the context of interpretability, and certainly uncertainty quantification is a big part of what we do. But again, are we really able to get the complexity that we need in terms of modeling dependent structure, and can we do it efficiently? So I think there's a lot of potential, and I'm not the only one, of course, at this interface between sort of machine learning, AI, deep learning, and statistics. And here's just a few of the things I thought about. I mean, I could have spent the whole talk just going through these things, and that's more of an overview lecture on this topic. But there's just so many things that have been done in this space, but in some by again by people in this webinar room, and there are new approaches that are coming out daily, and it's super exciting. I mean, sometimes it's a matter of embedding a neural model within a stat model. Sometimes it's embedding a stat model within a neural model. Sometimes it's something kind of completely new. It's a new probabilistic structure that has deep architectures. Um, and just there's some review papers, but they're already out of date, of course, in this topic. Just a plug, shamelessly, is that Andrew Zamet Manjon and I will do an introductory overview lecture at this at JSM. We're really honored to do that. If you're interested in a little bit more about how these hybrid things have just been used generally in space and space-time modeling. But I'm going to focus again on this talk on fire modeling examples. And so to do that, first I'm going to talk about spatial extremes, and I'm not a spatial extremes modeler. I just kind of play one on TV sometimes. Um, but yet I'm getting super interested in it due to my colleague Likun Zhang and our mutual interest in modeling complex space-time things. And so the point I want to make here is that environmental extremes almost always occur in clusters. And here's just some examples, from fire clusters for sure. Things you might not think about, like clear air turbulence, happens in clusters. So you can look at these maps before you fly. And then, like the drought monitor, I'll come back to this here again. You can see these clusters of where drought is more prevalent. And so, again, I apologize to the people who really do spatial extremes here. I'm just going to give a kind of a cartoon overview of it. But you would think, well, can't we just use these Gaussian processes or normal distributions to model these? And they're great for modeling the bulk of the distribution, but they're not good in dealing with the tails, because you can show that as you get towards asymptotically towards the tail higher quantiles, these cannot model dependence. And so, for example, if I had 2 points in this extreme area of drought in central Texas, if I was modeling with a Gaussian process, in the tail, they can't be dependent. And so you think, well, what about extreme value type distributions? And so the traditional ones that you might be familiar with, are really good at modeling, say, time series and return times for floods and that sort of stuff, given their heavy tail. But it's a lot harder to model the joint dependence with them. That said, I think this is one of the places in spatial statistics that has been the most innovative over the last 10 to 20 years in coming up with really clever ways to build this kind of dependence in models, for example, like max stable models. Some of these models are often not super flexible either, in the sense that, for example, the max stable model only allows asymptotic dependence, and it doesn't matter how far apart the stations are. So if I had a location here in South Dakota and it had a drought, is it really dependent on what's happening in Nevada? Maybe not. There's a big gap between it, so probably not. So that's not super ideal. And so a good model should be able to model things that are close together, should have stronger dependence than things further apart. If you get less extreme, you should have the dependence should decay. So, for example, if I'm in what typically when we see really intense areas of dependent extremes, um, they're smaller for that reason. It kind of makes sense. Dependent structure should vary, like over the US. I wouldn't expect that all parts of that domain should have the same kind of structure. So it's non-stationary and not only in just general spatial dependence, but also in the tails. So we would want to have both long-range asymptotic independence, so things far apart aren't really related. And then short range, we need to have the flexibility to be either independent or dependent. And so we want a model that can do that. And a great place to start was what's called the Max ID model that Brian Rich and Ben Shaby did back in 2012. Super powerful model. It was extended by Bob and colleagues in 2021. And so LeCun Zhang and I and our colleagues decided that we would extend this model, or could we extend this model, give it greater flexibility? Like I mentioned, can we account for this more complicated dependent structures and non-stationarity and include some realistic uncertainty? And I don't expect you to go through the stuff in the lower right here. I just put it there so you know there really is a model behind this. I will say this, though, the thing that makes this really work, it gives us the flexibility, is the way that we chose compactly supported basis functions, and then we allow the coefficients those get projected onto in the process level to be positive stable random variables that have their own tail dependent structure. So there's these parameters here floating around. There's a lot of them. Every place that you have a local knot point has this parameter, and that gives it a lot of flexibility. And the fact that they're local helps us a lot. So there's a lot of detail about that I won't go into. So it has great flexibility, but it has all these parameters. And so that Bayesian hierarchical model that I just showed you is really impractical. You can't, in any kind of practical problem that we care about, where we have hundreds of thousands or millions of time space locations, can't really implement it. And so this was where we thought, well, we could use a variational Bayes approach, particularly if we use one that's flexible enough that uses neural networks to learn parameter estimates. And that's exactly what variational autoencoders do. So that's what we decided to do. In a traditional variational autoencoder, you might have seen these before. Basically, we have input. It goes into an encoder, which is a deep neural net. This is actually a representation of this approximate or this variational posterior. That then gets projected in this low dimensional latent space. These are usually just independent normal random variables. And then those get the generative part of the model. They go into this data generating component, which is called the decoder, which there's another neural network to learn those parameters. So ideally, if you took samples from this, the latent process that you learned through the encoder, then you could run that through your decoder and get all these other samples over here on the right. And that's what's used for deep fakes. It's one of the ways that people do generative modeling for this sort of thing. There's other ways too. And so that's all great, but what we're interested in is we want to do sort of deep fakes, not really deep fakes, but we want to be able to generate samples from this Bayesian hierarchical model that have extremes in it. And the traditional BAEs don't really do that. To some extent you can, but they don't really accommodate those extreme behavior. So we modified this in a couple ways. One is that we let the latent dimensionals, instead of these being independent normals, are now independent heavy tail distributions in the latent space. And then that model that I described you, that innovation of the Max ID model that we like, that's what our decoder is. And so the neural networks then help us learn the parameters that project the inputs into this low dimensional space, and then also the parameters that go from this low dimensional space into our generative model. And so this is what it looks like. And again, I'm not going to go through these because I'm just putting it here to let you know there really is something going on, but also to show you where the neural networks happen. And so the encoder again, that's essentially my variational distribution. I'm learning the latent random variables given the images that I have or whatever inputs that I have. And there's the parameters that control that. It's a super simple model, but the parameters that control that, which are just means and variances here, are learned through a neural network, a deep net. And then this is the prior distribution here, and that's just these exponentially tilted um, positive stable random variables. Um, and so that's whatever prior model you want to put that's independent, it's going to work pretty well here. And then our extremes model that I gave you here gives us the decoder. And again, the parameters that control that model are what's learned um, by the neural net. And then how is it learned? Well, we use stochastic gradient descent to uh, um, minimize the elbow or the uh, variational evidence lower bound, sorry. And so that works really well. It's super efficient. There's an amortized um, computational effort up front to train it, but once it's trained, you can generate new samples almost instantaneously, regardless of the size, well, to some extent. And so that's super useful for all sorts of things. And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what it can be used for. One is to look at fire risk through the fire weather index, which is a way that's kind of based on meteorological conditions to give, one field for managers to be able to look at to try to say, okay, how bad is the fire risk in a particular area? And the other one is something that's kind of dear to my heart. It's actually modeling a really complex deterministic model that models the plume from a fire so we can understand its fire behavior a little bit better. So again, a lot of writing on the left. Don't worry about it. I'll just kind of give you a gist of what's going on here. So the weather index is essentially a NASA product, and it comes with a mixture of different data sources. We consider those just in the western part of the US, even though it's global data, just for illustration here. And that's also because it's a fire-prone area, of course, in the summer. So we had a monthly maximum for 2,887 grid cells for 128 months. So there's about 370,000 data points here. We do some pre-processing to remove seasonality and some marginal transformations to then put this into the XVAE model. That's what we call our extremes variational autoencoder model. And so if you look at this, I don't know if, so if you look at this, you can see that the XVAE realization on the right is almost indistinguishable from the observation. So these were generated, it's a generative model. So this is just one sample generated at one time. This is a different time. And if you actually looked at how the quantiles match up and some other metrics associated with extremes, they work really well. There's almost no part of that distribution that isn't accommodated pretty well here. Um, and so the nice thing about that is that, well, what can you do with that? Well, what we are interested in is, let's say I wanted what's the distribution of, of extreme fire danger, for example. So extreme fire danger is when this fire weather index is greater than 50. And so if we sample a bunch of, say, in this case, 30,000 samples from our model, which happens really fast, this is showing you what those exceedances look like. For this is just one plot. But this is a distribution then for four different areas. There's the Pacific Northwest, which doesn't have any risk right now in this area at this time, the California area, the Idaho area, and the Nevada area. And so you can see then these are the distributions of the area under risk in those different regions. So what we care about and what a manager might care about, certainly the ones that we've worked with seem to care about it. It's like, well, how does this change? Like, is the fire risk worse this year than it was last year, or this month versus last month? So we can actually show you what the distributions look like in different times corresponding to this. So this is just one way that you can use the output from this extreme variational autoencoder. Another thing you can do is emulate complex models. And so this is some work that we've just recently done. So wildfires, volcano emissions, air pollution, et cetera, are buoyant plume transport. So if a plume comes out of a smokestack, for example, it's going to have a buoyancy related to its interaction with the atmosphere, and then it's going to get transported due to advection type processes. And so turbulent events are particular examples of there's turbulence going on inside of these plumes as they evolve and as they move. And the extremes are turbulent events almost always have extremes in there as well. Right? In certain parts of the domain have extreme values. And so if you think about modeling these things, you can do it, and it's done with very high resolution fluid dynamic simulations for turbulence modeling. It's super expensive. These models can sometimes be as expensive as a big climate model because there's just so many uh, I guess equations and locations within these partial differential equations to account for simultaneously. So very computationally intensive. So we tried to see, well, could we see if we could emulate one of these models efficiently with our buoyant plume, or one of these buoyant plume models with our XVAE model. And so I'm only going to just show you the simulation because I think it's cool. But on the left is showing the data, which is from the simulation model, and the right is showing the emulation. And you'd be hard pressed to find places where they don't agree. There's a little bit if you actually analyze it, but the statistics are pretty good. And keep in mind, this is just one realization of that fire plume and that of that model. But we actually, because we have this, we're embedded in this Bayesian framework, we can get samples. So we can actually get very cheap samples from the simulation model so we can start doing uncertainty quantification, do parameter tuning of their model, investigate different scenarios, et cetera. So it's very exciting place to be, I think, is to try to model these very complex things, which, computer model emulation is something that statisticians have been doing for quite some time. It goes back to the 70s, actually. But to do it in a way that can handle extremes and this many locations in space and time at once is not as common for sure. Okay, so I think I have enough time to kind of finish up with the last example. And the last example is something that it interests me because of historically, I'm interested in modeling how spatial things change with time in general. So interested in this case in modeling wildfire spread. So this is showing you 10 uh, uh, burn scars or perimeters from a fire that was in California in 2017 called the Hay Press Fire. And you can see some interesting things, and this fire starts developing. And these are approximately about a day apart. They're not exact. You can start seeing some interesting things happen. You can see like, oh, a new area developed over here. And then you get these tentacles that come out, and those come out for all sorts of reasons. Why does the fire spread the way it does? Well, part of it's because of the way the winds are. Part of it's because that's where the fuel is, the elevation, the slope, the aspect. But unfortunately, the models that people use operationally for fire spread in real time, at least, um, were sort of developed a long time ago and not particularly adapted to data, at least other than just sort of general wind direction kinds of things. And so it assumes that the fire environment was homogeneous for the most part, and it isn't. As I mentioned, there's all sorts of things going on. And these complex fires develop their own weather too. So if I know what the weather is at some station nearby, say San Francisco or something, the on the ground weather conditions could be completely different because the fire generates its own weather. And so we want to combine a method that people have used in the past for fire spread, which is called a level set method, with this sort of dynamic data-driven learning. And so level sets, if you remember back from your calculus days, or some statisticians work with level sets in other areas, it's just a real valued function that takes on a constant value um, um, everywhere. So for example, in this three-dimensional image here, um, a level set would be given by this contour. And then why these are useful for fire modeling is because level sets, as they change, fires, like I said before, they sometimes merge together, they sometimes split apart, and level sets can accommodate that naturally. And not very many other kinds of models that we deal with have that kind of topological flexibility. And it turns out it's really easy to represent these because if you think about a level zero level set can be represented implicitly by what's called a sign distance function. All I need to know is where in my domain there are negatives and where there are positives, and the zero level set is in between those. And so when I looked at things like these um, fire perimeters, these can easily be represented as an implicit spatial field because I can take, well, everything inside the domain is negative, everything outside is positive, and I get my zero level set. So once I have that, then I want to evolve that fire front. And so there was some cool applied math work done back in the 1980s by Orsher and Sethian to model the fire spread of these sorts of implicit functions through advection equations. This is a very simple one, but don't worry about it here if that doesn't mean much to you. But the idea is, with a little simplification, is quite simple. We can model the evolution of this field at time t if we knew what the speed at the normal to the boundary was. And then you can see this is, okay, so this area has a bigger speed, so it evolved more in that direction, et cetera. And so traditional fire models kind of do this, but they have sort of one representation for that speed that's sort of useful over the whole domain. So not really learning what it is. So we want to learn what those speeds are. If we know what those speeds are normal to the fire front, then we can predict where it's going to go. The challenge is we don't have very many of these. If you look back at this, we only had, say, 10 observations to work with. That's not a lot when it comes to learning. So how do I model the speed from one time to the next? Well, I showed you before, there's you could use a space-time dynamic model. And we've done this. We've done this with traditional um, uh, space-time models. But my colleague and former student, Myung-Soo Yu, and I decided we would use echostate networks, which is a type of recurrent neural network that's super useful here. And the reason why it's so useful is because recurrent neural networks model how the spatial thing changes nonlinearly through time. But traditionally, they require a lot of data to train, and they require some extra structures, gated gates and stuff to make them to learn what the weights are inside of this recurrence that's happening in the middle. But the nice thing about an echostate model is that these weights are actually random. And you might be shocked that I could run neural networks with random weights. But so long as my output weights are learned and I do something sensible with the inputs, these models actually do well. And they're actually universal approximators. So why do they work well? That's a different story than what I can talk about in this talk, but they do work well in a lot of cases, and they work with limited data. So it's sort of a game changer if you don't have a lot of data and you still want the benefits of a neural network. I'm not going to talk about this slide, but I just want you to realize that it is a hierarchical model. All of this stuff here is the echostate network. Super easy. This can all be done offline. It's just generative model. You only have to really learn what's going on up here, the output matrix, and that's usually done with some sort of regularization. You can do other things. You can embed these in Bayesian models and whatnot. But it's a super useful framework and still gets the benefit of this deep structure. And so applying it to the hay press fire, we only had 10 observations. I'm not showing the first one, but I want to try to predict this last time. So say I'm a fire manager and I know what the fire is, how it's evolved the last 10 days. And this is one, see where to put the resources tomorrow. And so that's what I'm trying to get at here. And what this shows you is that look at the center plot. This is the forecast median given in red, and the blue is the truth. The sign distance function is actually the color in the background. And these are the credible intervals that are prediction intervals that go around these, and didn't talk about how those are generated here, but it's in the paper. They do a really good job of capturing the development. But I wanted to show you that even though it didn't get it perfectly, we did get the fact that there was going to be a spread in this direction and down here and also up here. And how do I know that? Well, because I can, this is a good way to show. So the background here is the speed that I estimated from that echo state model. Red in this case shows you time t or t minus 1. Blue is time t, and then the true time t is given by the black dotted lines. You can see where the speed is greater, there's more of we're modeling um, the, the evolution of the front much more accurately. You see that here, you see it down here, and you see it here. So this is exactly what we wanted. This is all just data driven. If we actually put science into this part of it, there's science in the level set evolution, but if we put science into the speed modeling, meaning covariates and meteorological information, it would probably do even better. So this is pretty cool. Just for, I know David Banks was online here, and he's a big fan of cellular automata, agent-based models. And so another student, Nick Grisha, built a similar model, but it was actually a bottom-up model, a stochastic cellular automata model, where we actually learned the rules of the fire evolution with symbolic regression, a genetic algorithm, and then it's sometimes called dynamic discovery. And then we also use an echo state model covariates in there as well, and got really nice performance for modeling the spread of fire. So there's multiple ways to do this, and that's just, a couple of them. So that's kind of it. I just to summarize, wildfires are increasing. We need to understand their risk if we want to help protect life and property and mitigate health impacts. I really truly believe that statistics has a big role to play here, and this is just one way that we can play a role, is to kind of combine these models with sensible uncertainty quantification. But I'd also just want to finish up by saying we've only scratched the surface. Um, I don't make any claims that what I showed you today are the best of anything, but there are some starting points in some cases, and just so many other people are working in this space now. It's super exciting. Um, I'm been doing this for 30 years, and I think I'm more excited now about research than I've ever been. So with that, I'll conclude and thank you so much for listening. Here's a few of the references, but if you saw something that I didn't put on here that you're interested in, just shoot me an email, um, and I'm happy to send you anything. Thanks so much.
Chris, thank you. This is amazing and just such important work. Are you willing to entertain a few questions?
Absolutely. Yeah. I hope I didn't go too long.
No, not at all. It was perfect. Um, if I don't, I think if we can manage it, people could just unmute and ask, but you would have to speak up because we can't actually see things. Maybe, Chris, if you stop sharing your screen. Amy, I see that you have your hand up. Maybe you want to speak and introduce yourself as well. And note that this is being recorded. And so please do note that in your questions.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. That was wonderful. I've only recently discovered this whole idea.
Amy, could you introduce yourself really quick?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Amy Braverman. I'm a statistician at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I've been here for about 25 years, and I do statistical methods for analyzing remote sensing data, and especially for uncertainty quantification on those remote sensing quote unquote data that you download from your favorite data repository. And I call them quote unquote data because they're not really data, they're really inferred. But okay. I saw Chris, I saw the two sessions at JSM last summer on amortized inference, and then the companion one on neural estimation. And I've been using I've been learning to use the neural estimators, and I've been using them to great effect with the help of Matthew Sainsbury Dale, who's down in Wollongong. So I'm really interested in this, and I've done a few things now that are in the same spirit as what you've done here. They're for different applications. I'm particularly interested in what you did with the fire plume modeling, but I didn't quite follow how you did that emulation. And I'm wondering
Okay.
if you could say more about that.
Yeah.
What was the model? There was an extremes model in between the encoder and the decoder, but there's also a time component in what you did.
Yeah.
And how did that fit together?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Amy, and
Yeah.
thanks for the question. In the it's that model actually assumes implicitly independence in time. Um, and so basically we're emulating it does accommodate what's happening at the other times because it's part of the learning process, but not explicitly. And so it it's not the same as if we just emulated one frame at a time, but it's almost that. I say that, and then we have a model that has time dependence in it as well, but it's not quite ready to present results publicly yet. But super important. So in that case, yeah, it's exactly the same model I described for the fire weather index. The only difference was the basis functions were different. We used non-negative matrix factor basis functions for that because the local basis functions that we used in the weather index were a little too smooth for what we needed there.
Thanks. Great
Sure.
talk.
Thank you.
David, if you could just jump in and introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Certainly. Thank you, Kathy. I'm David Banks. I'm a statistician at Duke University. It was a terrific talk, Christopher, and I'm embarrassed by the low technical level of what I'm going to ask about, especially given Amy's thoughtful and deep question. I would have thought that people in your line of work would be using the multivariate T processes that Keith Worsley sort of pioneered years ago. But that doesn't seem to be the way the field has evolved. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I probably there's people on this Zoom who could answer that question better than me historically why they haven't adopted it as much. I don't actually know that answer because I'm kind of new to extremes. Um, and I think actually I gave this talk in Wollongong, not I gave a talk on that model in Wollongong last November, and Noel Cressy asked me a very similar question. And you would think I would have gone off and looked at it, but he was basically just educating me on the history of some of that work. But I don't know, David. It's a great question. I'm kind of following, standing on the shoulders of the giants in this topic who came before me in the last 10 years. So I don't know, but it's a great question.
Thank you.
Ben would probably know the answer.
I could talk for hours, but this is it's not my gig. So thanks.
Kathy, are you handling questions still, or?
I think you might be muted, Kathy.
I thought I was, Chris. Apologies. But go ahead and handle yourself. So, yeah. Yeah.
Well, if you want to go ahead, I mean,
Yeah. I think Arka, please
Yeah.
introduce yourself and ask your question. Yes.
Hi, I'm Orko. I'm a new assistant professor in the Department of Statistics at UC Irvine. I work on spatio-temporal modeling, spatial modeling. I work on nearest neighbor Gaussian process, and of late, I'm interested in modeling spatial extremes. So, Chris, great talk. Two questions. You talked about fire weather index. I Did you put a reference to that particular paper, or is that available in archive so that I can take a look at that?
Um, good question. The fire weather index example is hot off the press. It's not actually out yet.
Okay.
But we have other examples in the paper. But LaCoon was super generous last weekend and we're working on the fire weather index as part of another project. And I said,
Okay.
hey, can you just run our model on that data so I can present it? And he did. So, but it will show up somewhere for sure. It just isn't out yet.
Okay.
That
Sorry.
particular data set. But um, the other example.
Blue model, yeah, I know, yes.
Yeah.
Another question, I believe in the extremal variational autoencoder, you may, like, generally the structure is the basis function or the parametric or the model that you use that doesn't account for like local temporal variations. Uh,
Right.
do you account for that when you are accounting for the fire weather index?
Not directly in the model that I presented today. That sort of goes to Amy's question that we don't have explicit temporal dependence in
Okay.
the XVAE model. We do have another model that does. We
Mhm.
talked about that model at JSM last year, but that hasn't been applied to these data.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Great talk. Thank you.
Thank
Uh,
you.
Jonathan, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and ask your question?
Hi there, my name's Jonathan Hershey. I'm at the Applied Math Department at University of Colorado, Denver. I work with recurrent neural networks and LSTMs in the context of fuel moisture modeling. When one of your early slides, you wrote like kind of a general form of a spatial or a temporal model, and you put f of t minus 1, so just 1 hour or like one time step previously. That's, very short term um, dependence. And I was wondering if you kind of think that some of the methods like transformers from that were originally developed with like natural language processing in mind are maybe less useful in the context of environmental science, where we're not trying to model super long-term dependencies. We're kind of assuming that if you know the state of a system and you know how to evolve it forward, you don't need to know that super long-term history. I was wondering if you could discuss your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. One of the reasons that I'm a fan of the echo state networks is because, you know, like the other recurrent networks, neural networks, it does actually account for long memory. Um, I do think that attention mechanisms and transformers have a role to play in particularly in um, events that are potentially extreme because the causal mechanisms are not what necessarily just happened at the previous time step for those. And I think those who do causal inference in this environmental space, um, if they haven't already, surely will start using attention mechanisms for those as well. So I agree with you 100%. The problem in things like what I work with the firefront evolution, is there just not enough time replicates to use anything close to, a full-on transformer, even a simple single head, single layer transformer couldn't be trained in that setting. So we'd have to use some sort of uh, transfer learning, which you could probably. There's a lot of fire scars out there that one might be able to do transfer learning on. So
Interesting. Thank you.
yeah.
Um, we're actually at time. Jennifer, is it okay if we go ahead and move forward? Uh,
Yeah, that's okay. Go ahead.
okay.
No worries.
Yeah. So there are quite a few questions in the chat. We'll try to capture those, and then maybe we can post answers along with the YouTube video. And again, we want to thank you for joining. And Chris, thank you for your work and your leadership in our profession, and just your contributions to society in general. And thank you for joining us today and sharing these very innovative and insightful looks at our profession. So please, everyone, join me in thanking Chris for this amazing work. So.
Thank you, Kathy, and thanks everyone. And if anyone has any questions, just shoot me an email. Happy to engage. But thanks again. I appreciate it.